You wake up, and for a fraction of a second, you genuinely believe the soft, synthetic fabric of the mattress beneath you is a lie. Your eyes snap open, your pupils dilating as they dart frantically toward the upper corners of the room, desperate to locate the faint, red infrared glow of the security cameras. There are none. There is only the dusty morning sunlight bleeding through the bent plastic blinds of a cheap, anonymous motel room in a city whose name you barely care to remember. You sit up, your spine rigid, your breathing shallow and controlled, bracing for a sudden impact or the sharp hiss of the pneumatic doors that never comes. The air in this room smells of stale coffee, cheap chemical detergent, and damp carpet, but to your utterly ruined senses, it is an overwhelming, chaotic symphony of odors. You press the palms of your hands against your face, feeling the rough, unfamiliar texture of your own skin. It feels foreign, like it belongs to an entirely different human being. And in every measurable, psychological way, it absolutely does. The man you once were, the man who kissed his wife goodbye on a rainy Tuesday morning an eternity ago, died. He did not die from a hollow point bullet in a dark alley, nor from a jagged blade in a chaotic scuffle. He died from the slow, agonizing, meticulous erosion of time and identity in a place that officially, legally, and geographically does not exist. You stand up and walk toward the bathroom mirror, moving with the silent, measured steps of a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. The reflection staring back at you is a hollowed-out shell, a skeletal structure wrapped in pale skin. Hands with eyes that look like they have stared into the absolute bottom of the abyss and found absolutely nothing there. You were once a high-level data broker, a brilliant analyst who lived in the invisible spaces between international banking and government intelligence. You traded in the world's most dangerous currency, raw, unredacted truth. You thought you were untouchable, protected by layers of encryption, offshore proxies, and the sheer arrogance of your own intellect. But you made the fatal mistake of tracing a specific, anomalous financial artery, a massive, silent flow of black-budget capital linking a prominent intelligence agency directly to the logistical network of an international cartel. You found the ghost money, and in doing so, you became a ghost yourself. The extraction was a masterclass in clinical, terrifying efficiency. There was no cinematic car chase, no dramatic confrontation in a rain-slicked parking lot. It was a mundane Thursday evening. You were walking to your car when the world simply ended. A sudden rush of heavy, synchronized footsteps behind you, the sharp, stinging prick of a pneumatic syringe against the side of your neck, and a heavy canvas bag pulled violently over your head. The chemical sedative hit your bloodstream like a freight train, instantly collapsing your reality into a suffocating, terrifying darkness. When your fragmented consciousness began to return, you were suspended in a disorienting, freezing void. You remember the deafening roar of military cargo plane engines, the sickening shifts in cabin pressure, and a cold so absolute and piercing it felt like tiny needles driving directly into your bone marrow. You were stripped of your clothes, your belongings, your dignity, and your identity in complete, terrifying silence. The facility you arrived at had no name, no coordinates, and no acknowledgement from any government on Earth. It was a black site buried so deep within a frozen, desolate wasteland that the very concept of the outside world felt like a ridiculous, childish fairy tale. Your cell was a masterpiece of architectural cruelty and psychological annihilation. It was exactly 3 paces wide and 4 paces long, measurements you would verify thousands of times until your feet bled. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling were painted a glaring, clinical, seamless white. They were coated in a dense, rubberized material that absorbed every single sound, swallowing even the echo of your own panicked breathing. Nadine, but the lighting was the true instrument of torture. A massive panel of industrial LED lights embedded in the ceiling blazed with the unforgiving intensity of a midday desert sun, and they never, under any circumstances, turned off. There was no sunrise. There was no sunset. There was only the eternal, blinding, inescapable present. Within the first 72 hours, your entire concept of time, the fundamental anchor of human sanity and biological rhythm, began to violently disintegrate. You desperately tried to measure the passing days by the meals they provided, sliding them silently through a mechanized stainless steel slot in the heavy door. It was always the same beige, tasteless nutrient paste designed perfectly to keep your vital organs functioning while denying you any sensory pleasure or comfort. But the architects of this invisible prison were actively scrambling your internal clock. Sometimes they would slide the tray in 3 times within what felt like a single agonizing hour, and other times they would leave you starving, trembling on the floor for what felt like endless, agonizing days. They were deliberately inducing a state of perpetual, nauseating jet lag, a constant, dizzying disorientation designed to keep your mind constantly off balance. You were nothing more than a lab rat trapped in a sterile, silent, glowing white maze, and unseen watchers were meticulously documenting your mental decay from behind the glass. You desperately attempted to build a fortress of routine to save your deteriorating mind. Like every man who finds himself trapped in the abyss instinctively tries to construct a fragile raft out of meaningless habits, you would force yourself to pace the exact length of the cell, counting your steps in a manic whisper. 1, 2, 3, turn. 1, 2, 3, turn. You would systematically recite the full names of every family member you ever had, verbally reconstruct the intricate plots of your favorite movies, and desperately sing the lyrics to songs you hadn't thought about in decades. But the machinery of the black site was flawlessly designed to grind down these pathetic human defenses. The silence of the facility was not merely an absence of noise. It was a heavy, physical weight constantly pressing against your eardrums, threatening to crush your skull. In the complete absence of any external stimuli, your starved brain began to violently manufacture its own. The auditory hallucinations started as subtle, dismissible things. The faint, metallic sound of a child crying somewhere deep within the ventilation shafts. The rhythmic, maddening ticking of a grandfather clock that didn't exist. The soothing, impossible sound of heavy rain beating against a window pane in a room that had no windows. You would press your ear flat against the cold, rubberized white wall, desperate, begging the universe for any vibration, any minute sign of life, only to slowly, horrifyingly realize that the sound was being generated entirely within your own deteriorating cortex. Cold, absolute paranoia set in. You began to obsessively suspect that the beige nutrient paste was heavily laced with experimental hallucinogens, or that the invisible air supply was being chemically manipulated to induce panic attacks and despair. Every single shadow cast by your own emaciated body became a lethal, creeping threat. The true trap, however, was not the physical cell, but the interrogations. Months into your confinement, or perhaps it was years, you had no possible way of knowing, the agonizing routine finally broke. The heavy steel door hissed open, and two massive guards, clad in unmarked black tactical gear, dragged you out. They wore dark, reflective visors, hiding their eyes, hiding their humanity. They never spoke a single syllable. They dragged you into a corridor of sterile stainless steel and strapped you aggressively into a heavy chair in a room that smelled violently of ozone, bleach, and old fear. You braced your body for the physical beatings, for the electric shocks, for the screaming demands for passcodes, server locations, and offshore bank account numbers. But none of that ever happened. The interrogator who finally walked into the room did not look like a monster. He looked like an accountant. He sat across from you, casually adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and simply looked at you with an expression of profound, clinical detachment. When he finally spoke, his voice was chillingly calm, polite, and conversational. He didn't ask you a single question about the encrypted hard drives or the missing cartel funds. Instead, he asked you about your childhood. He asked you to accurately describe the exact, precise shade of your mother's eyes. He slid a high-resolution photograph across the metal table, showing your house, your beautiful, suburban home, with a "for sale" sign on the front lawn. He calmly explained in a voice entirely devoid of malice how your wife had eventually moved on, how she had held a closed-casket funeral for a husband who supposedly died in a tragic, unrecoverable boating accident, and how another man was currently raising your only son. That was the exact moment the trap permanently closed around your throat, not with the dramatic slam of iron prison bars, but with a quiet, devastating whisper. You realized then, with absolute terrifying clarity, the true, horrifying purpose of this subterranean facility. They did not want your information. They already had it all, or they simply did not care anymore. They wanted your existence. They were meticulously, patiently dismantling your identity piece by piece, archiving your personal memories before permanently deleting them from the human record. You were not a prisoner of war waiting to be traded. You were an unwilling subject in a dark, classified psychological experiment heavily funded by black budgets and operated by absolute ghosts. You were undergoing the horrifying process of unpersoning. After that interrogation, something fundamental inside your mind simply snapped. You stopped pacing the floor. You stopped doing your pathetic, desperate push-ups. The fragile mental raft of your daily habits shattered into a million pieces, and you finally allowed yourself to sink quietly into the bottomless abyss. You learned to deeply embrace the white noise. You transitioned from a fighting human being into a creature of the void, a hollowed-out, and compliant shell that silently consumed the tasteless paste and stared blankly into the burning LED sun for hours on end. You stopped dreaming entirely because dreams require a subconscious mind that is still tethered to reality, and your reality had been surgically, permanently excised. You slowly forgot the faces of the people you loved. When you desperately tried to conjure your wife's beautiful smile, all your broken mind could visualize was the blank, terrifying, reflective visor of the silent guard. You forgot the very sound of your own voice. You had completely stopped speaking aloud, realizing there was absolutely no one to listen, and the physical sensation of your own vocal cords vibrating felt deeply invasive, like a dangerous stranger trespassing in your own mind. The intense paranoia evolved into a chilling, permanent apathy. You finally understood the horrific, undeniable genius of the machinery. The ultimate prison does not need steel chains, iron shackles, or barbed wire. The ultimate prison successfully convinces the inmate that the outside world is a ridiculous myth, that nothing has ever truly existed except the blinding white walls, the low hum of the ventilation system, and the agonizing, infinitely stretching eternity of the present moment. You had become perfectly, flawlessly institutionalized in a place specifically designed to erase the very concept of institutions, and then, just as suddenly, violently, and inexplicably as you were taken from the world, you were abruptly expelled back into it. There was no formal trial, no dramatic explanation, no release paperwork, and certainly no apology. There was only the sudden hiss of the cell door, near the rough application of a heavy blindfold, the sharp prick of another chemical injection, and a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep. You violently woke up in the back seat of a cheap rental car parked perfectly in a desolate, rain-slicked alleyway in a massive, foreign city. The car engine was running smoothly. The heater was blasting. On the passenger seat beside you lay your entire new existence, neatly packaged in a manila envelope. A fraudulent passport bearing a stranger's face, a cheap burner phone, and exactly $10,000 in unmarked, untraceable bills. You stumbled aggressively out of the vehicle, falling to your hands and knees on the wet asphalt, gasping desperately for air. The air smelled of heavy exhaust fumes, damp concrete, rotting garbage, and cheap street food. A perfume so incredibly potent, complex, inning and real that it instantly brought tears to your ruined eyes. People walked rapidly past the alleyway, deeply absorbed in their glowing smartphones, loudly complaining about traffic, worrying intensely about incredibly mundane things like taxes, grocery lists, and office politics. They briefly glanced at you, a pale, disheveled, terrified man weeping uncontrollably on the dirty pavement, with expressions of mild annoyance or fleeting pity, completely and utterly unaware that they were sharing the physical space with an actual ghost. You desperately wanted to scream, to grab them aggressively by the shoulders and tell them the truth about the White Room, about the silent, faceless guards, about the terrifying abyss that exists just millimeters beneath the fragile, paper-thin crust of their safe, civilized, ignorant world. But you remained completely silent. Now, you sit completely still on the edge of this cheap motel bed, tightly gripping the plastic burner phone in your trembling hands. You could easily try to call your family, to desperately tell them that you are still alive, that it was all a lie. But what would you actually say? The specific man they loved truly died inside that white room. If you attempt to go back to them now, you will only bring the horrific, lingering ghosts with you. The deep-seated paranoia still courses violently through your veins like a slow-acting poison. Every single time a police siren wails in the distant city streets, every time the fluorescent lights flicker in the hallway outside your door, your heart hammers viciously against your ribs and your muscles tense to the point of tearing. You know what does that mean? Burst bunt, fully expecting the door to burst open and the masked men to return. You realize the ultimate unforgiving cruelty of the black site. They didn't just lock you inside a secret cell, they permanently locked the secret cell inside of you. You successfully survived the world's most isolated, heavily guarded secret prison, but you never actually left it. The physical concrete walls are gone, but the invisible psychological bars remain forever, trapping you in a solitary confinement of the mind from which there is absolutely no escape. You are a dead man walking aimlessly among the living, carrying a dark, heavy secret so incredibly massive it threatens to physically crush you into dust with every single step you take. That is all for today. The story you just heard is fiction, but the reality of black sites, secret renditions, and absolute psychological isolation happens every single day in the hidden corners of the world. If this story made you think, leave a comment telling us what your biggest takeaway was. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories from the underworld. Until next time.